Good evening. What you just watched is the screening of PBS's five-part docuseries, Asian Americans, which highlights key moments captured over the 150-year history of Asian Americans in the U.S. As we begin our panel discussion, I'd like us to be mindful of 2 points. First, it has only been within the last 30 years that May has been designated and recognized as Asian and Pacific Islander American Heritage Month, a time to reflect on Asian Americans' contributions to history, culture, and achievements of the U.S. Second, Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the U.S. electorate. According to the Pew Research Center, more than 11 million Asian Americans will be able to vote this year, making up nearly 5% of the nation's eligible voters. Hello, my name is Laura Foe, and I am your moderator this evening. I serve as the chair of Asian Americans Impacting Virginia, a nonprofit established to mobilize Asian Americans to be represented at all levels of leadership in Virginia. By way of personal background, I'm a Vietnamese refugee who immigrated to the US with my family in 1979. Right here in Virginia, actually, and I completed my primary through high school education here in Virginia. And while watching this compelling screening, I felt proud learning of the accomplishments of Asian Americans in the US, but also saddened that I did not learn much about the history in school. We are undoubtedly living in historic times, and if we don't learn from our past, we are bound to repeat them. Here to help us bridge the past and the future and to provide us with guidance on how Asian Americans can continue to chart a path forward in our country, a country we consider home and a country that we love, are two distinguished guest panelists. Our first panelist is Ting-Ying Ooi, the Education Director of the 1882 Foundation. The 1882 Foundation is a nonprofit that seeks to broaden public awareness of the history and continuing significance of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, including through the recording of oral histories and strengthening public education about the Chinese and Asian American experience. As a lifelong educator, Ting-Yi seeks to improve the quality and teaching of Asian American history in schools as a curriculum consultant. Our second distinguished panelist is John Yang. He is the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, a nonprofit founded in 1991 with the mission of advancing the civil and human rights for Asian Americans through education, litigation, and public policy advocacy, including issues that impact the Asian American community, such as racial justice, voting rights, and immigration rights. I am honored to share this virtual space with you, John and Ting-Yi. Thank you for being here. We have a lot of questions from the audience in the queue, so I'd like to get started because there's a lot to cover. My first question goes to you, Ting-Yi, and it is, can you please talk a little bit more about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is referenced in episode 1, and the implications of the act's relevance today? Do you see parallels between the Chinese Exclusion Act and the immigration policies today?
Thank you, Laura. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882, which is why we took the name of the 1882 Foundation to recognize that. I think what people don't realize about the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, that there is more to it than, if they know about it at all, there's more to it than just excluding Chinese from being able to enter the country, or if they were here already, denying them citizenship. But it was set up against a background of Chinese who had come here already and efforts by those, particularly on the West Coast, to keep Chinese out. Chinese first began to come here in the late 1840s with the gold rush, and they were miners like other Americans who went to California for the gold rush. They came in much larger numbers between 1865 and 1869 to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. I can speak more about that later. But in the intervening years between 1869 and 1882, other Americans began to feel that their work, their livelihood might be threatened by the significant numbers of Chinese coming into the country. So particularly labor organizations and other residents of Western states began to react to this pressure that they felt was coming from Chinese laborers. And a lot of it came from the labor unions themselves, and they activated to try to pass legislation. To make a kind of a long story short, by 1882, they had generated enough strength nationally to be able to generate the Chinese Exclusion Act. But two precursors to that are also worth mentioning, because I think it has direct relevance to what we see going on today in the world. One was that there was an act in 1875 called the Page Act, which, with so many men coming into the country from China, it specifically said that women could not come in. It was under sort of the umbrella of the notion of Chinese women being prostitutes, that they were immoral. And this just was something that obviously would make it impossible for Chinese to be able to create families here. I mention that because of the way in which we can see maybe parallels to that by the kinds of legislation or executive actions that are pushed to try to do things in incremental stages that really impinge upon the rights of people to come into the country legally and then eventually obtain citizenship.
And John, I was going to follow up with Tingyi and talk to him about the Transcontinental Railroad, but I think this is an excellent time to segue to you, because we're talking about the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and literally 100 years later, in 1982, we have the Vincent Chen case. And that is considered a watershed moment for the API civil rights movement. Can you tell us a little bit about that case and how it impacted you?
Sure, and thank you for having us on this webinar. We really appreciate it, and talking about this history of Asian Americans. Certainly with respect to Vincent Chin's murder, it was tragic, and clearly justice was not served. One of the good things that came out of it, however, was this notion of an Asian American movement. Prior to that, certainly we oftentimes thought of ourselves with respect to only our own ethnicity, as Chinese Americans, as Japanese Americans, as Korean Americans. But this moment made us all recognize that in the eyes of most of the people in the United States, we were all the same. Now let's remember, Vincent Chin was Chinese American. The complaint that caused his murder was directed against the Japanese community with respect to the auto trade war. And so we all recognized that we had to come together and show solidarity in this moment. And in that sense, this was the rise of an Asian American civil rights movement of our own. Certainly we had elements of that in the past, even in the 1960s with people like Yuri Kochiyama, but this really galvanized it in a particular way. Certainly, my organization, one of our sister organizations that is based in Los Angeles, who was founded by Stuart Kuo, was instrumental in this. Stuart was part of that legal team that represented Lily Chin and tried to get legal redress for Vincent during that situation. Again, although the legal redress failed, clearly it started something new and something that continues to this day.
That's wonderful. And I'm coming back to you, Tingyi. If we could talk about, last year was the 150th anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And that is also referenced in episode 1 of this PBS docuseries. There is little mention, however, of the 20,000 Chinese laborers who built the railroad. Could you speak a little bit on that?
Sure. Yes, I think most people realize something about Chinese immigrants and the way they worked on the railroad, but I don't think they have quite the notion that 80 to 90% of the workers on the Central Pacific Railroad, the western end of it moving eastward, was done by Chinese laborers. So their work, their energy, their sacrifice was enormous. The physical challenges they faced were amazing. Going through the Sierra Nevadas, the most significant of those challenges was probably the Summit Tunnel that was built. And much of it was constructed during very, very difficult weather over the course of 2 years. And that the Chinese had to live in the worst of conditions, really, in terms of the environment and the weather. They also were underpaid for a long time. There was a strike that most people aren't aware of, where the Chinese, because they challenged a lot of the discrimination and feelings that they couldn't do the work in lots of different ways. So they went out on strike trying to get shorter hours from the 11 they were working a day to the 10, and also tried to supplement their income by getting higher wages to match some of the other workers that were there. So it's this kind of sacrifice that they made to try to get this railroad built. And of course, I think the iconic image of the two railroads or rail cars engines meeting there at the Summit Point, it was made first, I think, aware to many Americans, if they watched the Ken Burns series of the American West, that in that iconic photo, there's not a single Chinese worker who's being shown as part of that completion of the railroad. One other kind of thing that's kind of interesting about it, in many ways, the appreciation of Chinese workers was way more recognized at the time and for a number of years afterwards, and then kind of forgotten about history, which is kind of symptomatic of so much of the history about Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. For example, there are quotes from Charles Crocker, one of the main industrialists who was behind that, who talked about his admiration for the workers and was instrumental, of course, in bringing them over. Another one too toasted the Chinese at the end with a big toast at a dinner to mark the completion of the railroad, and singled out the Chinese workers for doing it. Belatedly, it comes to us in 2014. There was a recognition at the 145th anniversary by the Department of Labor to recognize the accomplishments of the Chinese railroad workers. And they recognize them collectively as a group with the honor of being put on the Department of Labor's Hall of Fame. So that is finally a recognition, albeit too late, of the work that they had done really to cement the two parts of the country together.
Yes, so literally, Chinese laborers built this country. And that's something, honestly, I did not realize until very, very recently, which is something that's, that should be taught in our schools. I want to fast forward a little bit to ask an audience question to you, and this is directed to you, John. What parallels do you see between the anti-Asian climate that led to Chin's murder and the anti-Asian climate today in response to the current COVID-19 pandemic?
Sure. Unfortunately, the parallels are uncanny. Certainly, you have this feeling of fear that's pervading the community. And I think that's a piece that is true for any other moment of anti-Asian racism that we've seen, whether it's the so-called yellow peril during the late 1800s that Ting Yi talked about, whether it is World War II with the Japanese American incarceration, whether it is after 9/11, or whether it is during Vincent Chin. And what we see is this fear in the community that causes us to be seen as foreigners. Specifically with respect to Vincent Chin, I often talk about this in this way. Ultimately, he was murdered because of a trade war. He was murdered because of a trade war between the United States and Japan over automobiles. And in that sense, our parallel to right now with respect to the geopolitical tensions between the United States and China are very, very similar. So that is causing that same sort of anti-Asian racism that we are seeing. You layer that with the COVID-19 pandemic. The reality is we are all fearful of our own health, of our own safety. That's natural. But then when you layer that with that misinformation about what causes COVID-19, who are carriers of COVID-19 or how it's transmitted, and this misinformation about how Asian Americans or Chinese Americans, Chinese specifically, are special carriers, that's what causes this anti-Asian sentiment that we see. And that's what we have to work on combating, is how this is a medical crisis, absolutely. And all of us need to work hard as a community, every single race, every single ethnicity, to combat this medical crisis. But that is far different than characterizing this virus in racial or ethnic terms.
And John, how?
One thing here, Laura?
Of course.
Yeah, John makes a good point. And of one thing in particular, I'd just like to emphasize that I think the Asian American community is really stereotyped by that notion of the perpetual foreigner. It's one of those big stereotypes that we have to fight against constantly. And I really feel for students in our schools today. Of course, I was a teacher in schools and administrator for 35 years, so I kind of identify with the kind of feeling that would go along with this, for how, if they've been born here and really feel themselves fully as American, how they then reconcile that with the kinds of attitudes that are exhibited sometimes in our media today.
Yes. And to that point, how can our communities find allies or address this concern? Are there opportunities for training or education or outreach, having allies outside and within the API community?
If I might, absolutely. And that is one thing that I feel a great sense of comfort in, is that the African American community, the Latinx community, the Native American community have all stood together in this COVID-19 time. All of us are recognizing different disparities because of COVID-19, whether there's different disparities with respect to health, whether there's different disparities with respect to racism. And the degree to which my sister organizations, the NAACP, the National Urban League, Unidos US, MALDEF, the National Congress of American Indians, have stood up together to decry this racism, certainly makes me believe in that better future. Other things that all of us can do as a community, one of the things that we've talked about is how do we become better community members to each other, by standing up for each other. So if you see someone that is a victim of a hate incident, is there something that you can do? And our organization, as well as other organizations, are offering training to give you the tools to react to that situation. Certainly, we're not asking people to be superheroes. We're not asking people to put themselves physically in harm's way. But there's little gestures that, whether it's our community or other communities, can do to make that victim feel just a little bit more protected. And that's so important in this time, again, when we're feeling so much fear.
That's excellent. I actually had an opportunity. I know that you partnered with Hollaback to provide some ally training and bystander training. And one of the things, they're very simple tips. And as you said, not to put yourself in harm's way, but be a distraction, drop a cup of coffee, just basically break that attention that is kind of coming from the perpetrator to the victim, and kind of, just breaking that tension. I thought it was excellent, and it applies to all harassment. And I'm really, really glad that you said that COVID-19 is exposing racial disparities in other communities of color, Black communities and Latinx communities, and that we all need to band together to fight this. So I appreciate that observation. Thank you. Ting Lee, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think really from 1882 Foundation's perspective, this is really the key that we're talking about. How do we make that outreach to the community, to the schools, so that this history can get heard? And one is exactly what John has touched upon, which is, I think, the intersectionality really of the interests that we have with other groups, particularly Latino community and the African American community, of how we can work together to bring out a lot of these things. I've been working for a number of years here with different organizations here in Virginia to see what we can do to try to influence the curriculum in the schools.
Yes.
I was always intimately aware of the standards of learning here in Virginia, how we tie the content about Asian American experience, the Asian American experience, to what is something that should be taught already. And I think maybe the key point to make here is that we tend to isolate this time, for example, Asian American Heritage Month, as a time when we address this. That's why this show is going on right now here. But really, the key thing to remember is these are American stories. We're all Americans.
That's great.
And I think we recognize the importance of trying to integrate these stories as much into the regular curriculum as is possible. If I can pick a couple of examples from what we saw in that trailer, Patsy Mink, for example, the first woman of color to be elected to Congress. Hers is a remarkable story. From a teacher's point of view, looking at that one photograph where she's surrounded by all these males, and there's one other person of color, I believe it's John Conyers, who's in there, but all the rest are males. And here is a perfect learning tool. It's about women's rights. It's not just about immigration. It's not just about Asian Americans. It's looking at this story, in its totality, all about America. Citizenship. Wong Kim Ark is the landmark case that talks about why we, if you're born in the United States, automatically are Americans. That the Supreme Court affirmed in 1898. That is the 14th Amendment. That's what citizenship is about. due process, equal protection under the laws. These are things John can speak to much better than I, but these are kinds of cases that exist that it's not like you have to stretch the standards of learning. No, they fit right there in the midst of it to be able to be taught about. And John, maybe you should have addressed this some more too.
No, that's fine. I mean, the only thing I would add, going to what Ting said, was you think about some of these landmark cases, and Wong Kim Ark is a perfect example. People forget that along with Plessy versus Ferguson, which established that so-called separate but equal doctrine, was a case called Lum versus Rice that established the exact same principle for Asian Americans. So when you're talking about these principles of civil rights, there is an Asian American thread that runs through it as well. And finding ways to teach that story is absolutely important because it makes us all feel more American and more together.
Can I add just one other little case that I think just goes to that point too? One thing reminds, I think, each other of us of something else, but there's a case too from Mamie Tate in San Francisco way back in 1882, I believe, or 1888 rather. And her parents petitioned the San Francisco schools to admit her to the only schools that existed then, which were white schools. And she was successful. The California Supreme Court ruled in their favor. But instead, they the city of San Francisco circumvented the rule by creating a school for Mongolian and Oriental children, as it was called. So rather than having a precedent upon which later Plessy versus Ferguson could have been looked at differently, you have that particular case. Again, these are things that are part and parcel of the experience that really should be part of a larger curriculum, a more inclusive curriculum.
I just had an audience question come up it's related to that as well. And the audience member says, I too am dissatisfied with the Eurocentric focus of world history taught in schools. This is particularly disturbing in the IB programs in which there are many Asian students. How can we influence? I'm thinking that this audience member is asking for actionable steps to influence the VDOE to rectify this in general. Any thoughts, Ting-Yi, as a curriculum specialist?
Yeah, I think it may be a little harder. I'm seeing here the question about world history specifically, but there is a huge topic area that is something that's included in the standards that really needs to be taught, and that's human migration. So you take a topic like human migration, which has, again, echoes for today's world and what's happening here about people who are refugees coming from lots of different parts of the world into different parts of the world. But what is it that caused the Chinese to leave in the first place? There's an aspect of looking into the Chinese history there, or more recently looking at the Vietnam War and the impact that had on stirring immigration, not just here to the United States, but to France, to lots of other places. The impact of the Korean War. So there are all these things that are part of a huge unit, which is that of human migration in world history. So I would suggest to parents that they really start a dialogue with their teachers, the curriculum specialists in their schools. There's usually an office in every school division that is supposed to oversee the curriculum, and they go through periodic times to revise it. I can give you an example here from Virginia again too. The Korematsu case in 1942, I guess it was initially 40,
Right.
about the Japanese American internment camps. In 1988, that was revisited finally, make a long story short, and it led to the awarding of reparations for Japanese Americans who had been interned. And the 1882 Foundation took that as its model for getting an apology from the United States Congress, also for what it had done with the Chinese Exclusion Acts. But my point is that here in Virginia, we were able last year to get a resolution passed, which the 1882 Foundation submitted to the General Assembly here in Virginia to recognize Korematsu Day, a way to honor Fred Korematsu, and recognize the day in Virginia classrooms, so that it is now really part and parcel of the obligation of teachers to look into that and recognize January 31st as a day in which to recognize what had happened back during World War II with Japanese Americans.
Thank you, Ting-Yi. That's very, very educational and informative. I always think that when we have these heavy discussions about things that have been done, what we can do to move forward and what we can do to forge new partnerships and new opportunities and to organize. And, John, this is something that we touched on. I know organizing has taken on a different style these days, given that we're in shutdown. Could you talk a little bit about how that has affected your work, your advocacy and organizing work? And also, could you talk about, I have a question from the audience here about the importance of the census and API civic engagement. As I mentioned at the top of the introduction of the panel, we are the fastest growing ethnic group in terms of the US electorate, so.
That's right, and we've grown by, according to the census, we've grown by 78% since the 2000 census. And that's an incredible amount. Our population is still a largely immigrant population. About 2/3 of our population are immigrants. Over 90% of our population are either immigrants or children of immigrants. And so when it comes to organizing, when it comes to making sure that we are standing up for our community, part of it is just educating. Certainly when it comes to census, it's literally being counted, making sure that we're not invisible. During this COVID-19 pandemic, it is a little bit harder because we can't do the door-to-door outreach that many of us are familiar with. And it is through these types of webinars, it's through digital organizing that we really need to make sure that we're standing up for our community. Definitely, I cannot plug the census enough because that is critical to making sure we understand who we are as a community, not just the Asian American community, but the American community as a whole. Because you guys are absolutely right that the demographics are clearly in our favor, that the Asian American population will continue to grow. And what that means is making sure we understand our community, all of the different segments of our community, right? Because we have to remember, this notion of an Asian American community is somewhat of a fiction. We're dealing with 50 different races and ethnicities, over 100 different languages. And how do we stitch all of us together? Making sure we understand who all of us are is critical to what we do. And we have to remember also that this year is a presidential election year, and making sure that we all turn out to vote, because that is part of our power that we have in organizing, our power to show that we matter. On one level, we're still, some would consider a small minority, but we're at about 6.5%. And if you think about the number of votes that made the difference in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in the last presidential election, that can easily be the difference within our community. And so we have to think about how we make sure we have that power, how we make sure we have that voice. And so certainly I will plug the census, making sure that everyone that is watching this has responded to it. If you have not, you have until October 31. Please do tell your friends, tell your family to do that, because it's critical to our community.
And there's no citizenship question.
There's no citizenship question.
Information is absolutely secure and cannot be shared with any other agency for what, or made public
70 years.
70 years. So that's
Yes.
the 70-year rule, which is something when it comes to Asian American community, those are the two things that are really, really important to us, our privacy. Tingy, I've gotten a couple of questions for you on this, and we're going to have to start to wrap up. But are there any books that you would recommend, Asian American history books that you would recommend, that you've learned from, that you've taught from?
Yeah, I think there, especially given sort of the way the preview here and also the discussion, particularly about Vincent Chin, one comes to mind. It's, I guess historical fiction would be the best way to describe it. Peter Ho Davies is the author's name, and it's called The Fortunes. And it actually is 4 stories put together in one book, and it fictionalizes an account of, in the first part, of a young man who is a worker on the railroad, but not the typical kind of worker. He's actually the steward, if you will, to Charles Crocker, one of the industrialists that I mentioned before. And he works on the train, and he sees a lot of the Chinese workers alongside. And so there's this kind of view that he has of being on this train, and rather comfortable, but he's also put in contact with all sorts of other people. It's a very interesting take on the building of the railroads. The second part deals with the Chinese American actress Anna May Wong, who never achieved the success that she probably deserved. Her biggest disappointment in life was being passed over for the role of the lead in The Good Earth, which was then played by a white person. And then a third story is really about Vincent Chin. It's about his murder, but told through the voice of his friend that was mentioned here in the trailer. who basically was trying to do what little he could to save Vincent's life there before he died. Then the last is kind of a piece there of a contemporary look at what being Chinese American in a more broader sense, Asian American is like. A couple of other names, Erica Lee, of course, has some great books out. There's one called Driven Out by Gene Felcher that really, if you want to look at some of the attempts in the early part of the history, before, during, and after the Chinese Exclusion Acts, that are really very helpful too in looking at some of these things.
It's wonderful, thank you. One last question I wanted to ask you, John, as this relates to what allies can do and what we can do to help the Asian community during this time of anti-Asian sentiment. Do you have, or is there like a help center or a reporting center for people who have faced discrimination or harassment or violence because they are Asian? And do you have information?
Absolutely. So for people that have experienced anti-Asian hate, we would ask them to report it at our website, www.standagainsthatred.org. It's all one word, standagainsthatred.org, because having accurate data on these incidents is critical to the storytelling. It's critical to explain to lawmakers and policymakers why this is wrong. And certainly I would ask people to visit our website, advancingjustice-aajc.org, if you want to learn more about bystander intervention training, if you want to learn more about some of the resources related to COVID-19, sort of how we could all stand together and learn about these different aspects. You could also learn more about the census there. I saw a question about privacy protections. Certainly privacy protections now are much different than they were in World War II. World War II, the Census Bureau did use census data against Japanese Americans. Tragic episode, but for that reason, the laws were changed. And now the privacy protections in place are stronger than any other privacy protection in the government. The government cannot reveal individualized data, even in light of the Patriot Act and other quote unquote national security concerns such as that. So in that sense, we absolutely have to be vigilant because we are always concerned about what a government can do. But at the same time, I feel confident that we should be responding.
That's really reassuring. Thank you so much. So that concludes this panel. I have really, really enjoyed learning and listening to the both of you, Tingyi and John, and all of the work, incredible work that you're doing, bringing what we know from the past and the history and bringing it into the present and making sure that we have a path forward as Asian Americans in this country, as Americans, and as being part of and shaping American history. So thank you very much for your expertise. I'd like to thank VPM and in particular Terry Gao and her Benefe Gao and her team, and specifically Carla Siqueiros, who helped with all of the virtual support here, which I have to say, Terry was so creative because when this first came out, the idea to do this, it was going to be a regular town hall at some kind of convention center. But to be able to put this together virtually and to get all of the pieces for people to be engaged has been phenomenal. Just so you know, we had over 300 RSVPs to this event, which is wonderful. I'd like to thank the community partners who made the screening possible: Asian American Society of Central Virginia, Asian Americans Impacting Virginia, Asian and Latina Solidarity Alliance of Central Virginia, and the Richmond Story House. And of course, to PBS for creating this incredible 5-part docuseries, Asian Americans, that covers 150 years of Asian American history in the US. You can watch all 5 of these episodes. They're going to be airing on VPM. Episodes 1 and 2 will air immediately after this discussion, starting at 8 and again at 9, these episodes 1 and 2. And tomorrow, Tuesday, May the 12th, you can watch episodes 3, 4, and 5, starting at 7, 8, and 9. And you can set your DVRs and watch them and talk to your children about them. This is a perfect homeschooling opportunity, actually. And I want to thank the audience so much for being a part of this conversation. We got so much feedback and questions from the audience, and that's what really fueled this incredible discussion. And one thing I really ask you to do, aside from watching this 5-part series with your family and thinking about it, is encouraging you to tell your story. One of the things that Ting Yi and his foundation does is to chronicle and record storytelling, because as you know, storytelling is what keeps history alive. And you can go to vpm.org/Asian Americans or via email to asianamericans@vpm.org to include that discussion. Thank you everyone for attending. This has been a phenomenal event and we hope to continue moving forward. Have a good
Thank you very
evening.
much, Laura.
Thank you.